5, it's fine. No. All right, so 12, 13, and 14. Okay.
Is there a 14? There is.
14 is basically like the epilogue
Okay, yeah.
for all intents and purposes. All right. It's a very open-ended question to start out because, again, I don't have study questions, so I just pull this off the top of my head. What did you guys think of chapter 12? We go from this scene of this one ghost that was so we back in chapter 10, I think it was, where you had this the lady that was consumed wanting to see her son, Michael, and the entire encounter there. And then in chapter 11, you have this one ghost that has this lizard, and the angel that killed the lizard, and that was that was awesome. That whole scene, and then you have George kind of explaining that, and then you come to chapter 12, and C.S. Lewis is like, "Hey, is there another river?" And what does he see? Why does he ask if there's another river that they're coming up on? Yeah. He sees the light kind of reflecting on the bottom of the leaves of the trees. He thinks, well, that's just the reflection of what's above, kind of reflecting off the water and hitting the leaves again. But it's not a river. What is it? It's not possible to hog the chat.
It's a parade.
Yeah. It's. I was wondering if somebody was going to try to pick another word, but parade was the word that was coming to mind. It's essentially right. It's a parade. Who's the parade for?
Exactly.
Shut up. Right. There's a lady, as George explains, named Sarah Smith. Now, what's going on in this parade? There's an awful lot of fanfare and hullabaloo and all this stuff that's happening. They're all sorts of spirits, and they're throwing flowers like confetti. And there was music that was just beautiful music and everything. And he remembers that she was beautiful and all this stuff. And when C.S. Lewis asks, he says, she seems to be a person of particular importance. And George answered, yeah, she's one of the great ones. You've heard that the fame in this country and fame on earth are two quite different things. And he carries on. He's like, who are all these young men and women with her? And he says, they're her sons and daughters. I love C.S. Lewis's reply. He said, she must have had a very large family, sir. And George's reply is really kind of very interesting. He says, every young man or boy that met her became her son, even if it was only the boy that brought the meat to her back door. And every girl that met her was her daughter. Now, what do you think George meant by that? Thank you, Kessa. You're not wrong. Mary Poppins.
Well, Lewis beelines to a zero-sum kind of thinking.
I'm sorry? Meaning that George is implying or is saying, oh, I think what it really was is it's very indicative of her behavior on planet Earth. She treated everyone like that. And, Kessa, you're not wrong. In what you said reminded me a great deal of my grandmother. I can see in that statement exactly how my grandmother was. And I took a moment and was like, kind of wonder if this is happening up there with Nanny right now. Anyways, yeah, he says, her motherhood was of a different kind. Those on whom it fell went back to their natural parents loving them more. Few men looked on her without becoming, in a certain fashion, her lovers. But it was the kind of love that made them not less true, but truer to their own wives. So this lady, Sarah Smith, whom Lewis had never heard of, and was probably a name that he just picked out, he said she was the kind of person that made others better by her lifestyle, essentially. Agreed?
Yes.
Like, disagree? No one was agreeing, so I got nervous. Okay. Synergy. Yes. Now, as they're proceeding, we come across these. Someone kind of approaches the procession, and who is it? I don't see Cappy.
Yeah. That's her former husband.
Yes, but he takes an interesting form because it's not just him. There's two of them, right?
In a sense.
In a sense, yes. Yeah, yeah, he is. I love what Sarah says. The one of the very first things she says is she calls my name. She says, Frank, before anything else, forgive me for all I ever did wrong and for all I did not do right since the first day we met. I ask your pardon. That really sets up her character in a very specific way, and it sets her in contrast to the other side of the conversation that she's going to have with Frank. And so, there are these quote two ghosts, but as Unger said, they're not really two ghosts. What they're yeah, and that's a theme that runs through these last 3 chapters. Really, it's run throughout the whole book, but it finally kind of gets explained here. When I say they're two ghosts, what were actually the two ghosts?
There's a dwarf and a puppet, but a giant puppet.
Yes. And which one's really Frank?
Yes.
Yes. If we're going to be honest, the one that's actually the one that we believe is the real Frank, or is kind of direct, that we are kind of direct towards, is the dwarf, right?
Yeah.
because Lewis, the one that's speaking, is this marionette, this puppet, whereas Sarah is like almost never addresses the puppet. She always focuses on the dwarf. So what's the struggle that Frank really seems to have with Sarah?
I'm gonna copy and paste a quote from Jan Silvius. Not Lewis for once. Topic is codependency.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I would say it boils down to self-pity.
Well,
It's
it's down to what?
self-pity.
Oh,
with a-
self-pity. Sorry.
It's self-pity with a purpose.
Hence the coercive side.
Yeah. Self-pity for the intent of having power over someone.
Yes. Frank was all about having control. He wanted to, as we see later, he didn't want other people to be happy when he wasn't. He only wanted others to experience joy when he could. And if he couldn't have it, then he didn't want anybody to have it. And something I noticed, I noticed really powerfully, I think it was back in, might have been in chapter 10, might have been in chapter 11, but the bright spirits there is this incredible earnest sincerity in their speech. In that it's not that there's not a filter, it's just that they literally, it's almost as if their ability, how do you put this? We're finishing off the story, we're finishing off the book tonight, so I don't feel like I'm giving anything away. What George explained, how hell or the evil cannot place itself on the good. It's kind of in that regard that these spirits don't have any regard for the concerns of the ghosts. The ghosts are trying to what's the term? Transpose? Maybe? I don't know. Trying to transpose their perception and their beliefs over onto these spirits, and the spirits are just like, I ain't having none of that, man. It's like it's not about that anymore. And so a lot of the things that they say come across as very blunt, and it's humorous. And one thing in particular, what was it? Right before chapter 13, the puppet's talking. Sarah just said, I don't need you anymore. In her mind, meaning that she has fulfillment now. And so Frank says through the puppet, he says, would to God, or would to good, would to good I had seen her lying dead at my feet before I heard those words. And then he repeats that over and over and over. And then Sarah says, Frank, look at me. What are you doing with that great ugly doll? Let go of that chain. Send it away. It's you that I want. Don't you see what nonsense it's talking? And then a little bit later she says, You great goose. What's the good of talking like that here? You know as well as I do that you did see me lying dead years and years ago. Not at your feet, of course, a bed in a nursing home. A very good nursing home it was, too. Matron never would have dreamed of leaving bodies lying about the floor. It's ridiculous for that doll to try to be impressive about death here. It just won't work. And you're just like, what? How do you pull that out of this conversation? But it's... Yes. But I think the thing that I get out of it is just the completeness of joy and the absolute disregard of all of these fancifications of death and everything, because because Sarah and the other bright spirits have transcended death. They have transcended evil. They have transcended grief now. They're beyond it. And so their speech mimics that, and it displays that that belief, which I think is really poignant, and it hits harder a little bit later. How, yeah, and that's a really good point. For a ghost that's controlling that has essentially made another ghost for him to play off of, that must be really shocking. That his attempt to assert his self-pity over someone else here has absolutely no effect.
I would take the not wanting anyone else to be happy unless he is. I would take that a step farther. This is someone who's not capable of being happy. He enjoys being unhappy, and he will not permit anyone else to be happy if he possibly can.
I don't think that's unreasonable.
And I would say, I would add that, I would agree with that, and add that I think that's because the unhappiness is about him. And you'd rather have the unhappiness, people be unhappy about him than happy about something else.
Boy, that rings of another familiar quote that's, I can't remember if it's mentioned here, but it's from Paradise Lost, the most famous quote from Paradise Lost. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. It may be miserable here, but at least it's my miserable. Doggone it. I'm gonna have to reread that. Oh, wow. Okay. Sure. Sure. That's underhanded. Now, what eventually happens to Frank? Yeah. He eventually becomes this puppet, this image that he has made of himself. He basically becomes that and is consumed by it. Mm-hmm. What happens after the puppet vanishes, as it eventually does? Yeah. He gets exactly what he wants. And that's another line that's quoted earlier in the book, isn't it? There are only two people in the end. Those who say to Christ, "Thy will be done," and those to whom Christ says, "Thy will be done." Boy, what a powerful statement that is. That one will shake you up. And what happens when after the puppet, the tragedian? How do you pronounce that?
I think that's right.
Tragedy with an an at the end. Tragedian. Oh, well, that's what I'm saying. Whether or not it's right. When he vanishes, what? I love this part. What happens next? Not at all. Matter of fact, Sarah goes back to the parade, and everybody just starts singing again. And it's just this reflection of how her joy is complete. That the sorrow and self-pity and all of this that Frank tried to cast on her didn't do a thing. Reality didn't change one bit. Quite possibly. And you compare that because what Sarah said in the beginning, forgive me. She's begging his forgiveness for all the things that she done, even though that she was held as one of the great ones. And all that Frank can do is try to drag her under this idea of, I don't want you to be happy because I'm not happy. And you get this greater picture of just how really complete she is now, because her first thing was still to beg forgiveness of him, even though the entire time perhaps the greater misdeed was against her by Frank. It's really it's a really telling contrast between these two people, which Lewis is really good at, just kind of drawing these comparisons and just managing to show you exactly what you're looking at. Any questions or thoughts that you guys have up to this point? I don't want to just blaze by on my own, only on my stuff.
I think this one's unsettling because I think this is probably one that we can all relate to at some point, because we've all had some sort of suffering or struggling in our life. Some of us way more than others, but we've all had some sort of difficulty because sometimes life sucks. I think that we've all, if we're honest with ourselves, have realized that we have chosen to be miserable and to feel sorry for ourselves and to enjoy other people's pity at some point.
Yeah, very much so.
I think this one's unsettling because it's something that everybody is in danger of falling into.
And as you go on, George addresses this. Because C.S. Lewis, Lewis even brings up to him. He says, yet, even now I'm not quite sure. Is it really tolerable that she should be untouched by his misery, even in his self-made misery?
Yeah.
And he's like, shouldn't she still... Is it wrong for her to pity him? Kessa.
Sorry, I'm just not very sensitive to this guy.
Bright Spirit would have looked at her and said, I don't think you were supposed to say that. Lewis says, I hardly know, sir. What some people say on earth is that the final loss of one's soul gives the lie to all the joy of those who are saved. And George says, well, you see that it doesn't. Then he says, I feel in a way that it ought to. Yeah, that sounds very merciful, but see what lurks behind it. And this is where I think the book has really been going. It really kind of draws the line to the finality here. Kessa! Quit. I'm just reading. She's putting it in the text. Can't even get to it. Would you like to lead? The demand of the loveless and the self-imprisoned that they should be allowed to blackmail the universe. That till they consent to be happy on their own terms, no one else shall taste joy. That theirs should be the final power. That hell should be able to veto heaven. And this is where we tie back into what Unger taught in Romans, because boy, is this fun. It must be one way or the other. Either the day must come when joy prevails and all the makers of misery are no longer able to infect it, or else forever and ever the makers of misery can destroy in others the happiness which they reject for themselves. I know it has a grand sound to say that you'll accept no salvation which leaves even one creature in the dark outside. But watch that sophistry, or you'll make a dog in a manger of the tyrant of the universe. Exactly. And whew, that's, for a guy like me, that's hard. Because I'm the guy that generally has to be told if you try to please everyone, somebody's not going to like it. I like to dissolve conflicts. I don't like conflict. I don't like when people argue. I like to consider myself to a certain form a peacekeeper. I don't want, if there's a grievance between people, I want them to work it out. Because tension between individuals bothers me. But when I read something like this, I believe I can be coerced by someone who doesn't come across happy, and I want to go and make sure they're okay. And I will often, if there's a party going on but someone's sulking in the corner, I'll go be with the person who's sulking in the corner. So this here is hard, but I understand it. The idea that eventually joy or misery has to win out. You cannot go on forever trying to reconcile both. Eventually, either total joy is going to win and those that would prefer misery are cast out, or joy can never be complete and misery will always have the power to cancel out joy. What do you guys think? And you're right. Which is actually George's next point. What?
Is that a Guardians of the Galaxy quote?
It's a Marvel idea. How dare you, Bob? So George is talking about how true pity, or the difference between the action and the passion of pity, and he's talking about this idea of the weapon on the other side, and how it changed darkness into light, evil into good. The whole picture of the lizard again. How you have to kill something bad in order to make it good, sort of idea. No, maybe not. Maybe not entirely. Maybe I'm overanalyzing. Every disease that submits to a cure will be cured, but we will not call blue yellow to please those who insist on still having jaundice, nor make a midden of the world's garden for the sake of some who cannot abide the smell of roses. Then Lewis asks this really interesting question, which opens our eyes to a truth that I think it was something that we hadn't really considered up to this point. He says, you say it'll go down to the lowest, sir, but she didn't go down with him to hell. She didn't even see him off by the bus. And, on the surface, you're like, yeah, he didn't. Or she didn't. And George is like, where did you want her to go? And Lewis is like, well, back by the bus. You know that big gulf beyond the edge of the cliff over there? You can't see it from here, but you got to know where I'm talking about. And George is like, okay, come here. Let me show you something. And what do? They kind of do. George pulls out this blade of grass, and they look down at the ground. He uses the end of the grass to point out there's this crack in the ground. He says, and George says, I can't be certain that this is the crack you came up through, but you didn't come up through anything any bigger than this crack, essentially is what he says. And of course, Lewis is like, what? He's like, but I saw this huge abyss, and there were cliffs just towering up. And then on top of the cliffs, there's this country. And George's like, well, you were getting bigger on the way here. And then Lewis asks the question that is just, oh, this is where it gets real. He says, do you mean that hell, all that infinite empty town, is down in some little crack like this? Oh my goodness. And this, oof. George says, yes, all hell is smaller than one pebble of your earthly world, but it is smaller than one atom of this world, the real world. Look at that butterfly. If it swallowed all hell, hell would not be big enough to do it any harm or to have any taste. Lewis says, it seems big enough when you're in it, sir. George answers with, maybe the quote of the book. He says, and yet all loneliness, angers, hatreds, envies, and itchings that it contains, if rolled into one single experience and put into the scale against the least moment of joy that is felt by the least in heaven, would have no weight at all that could be registered. And holy cow. If that doesn't blow your mind and yet ring of scripture so powerfully. Paul even quotes that. I am convinced that these momentary trials are nothing when you compare to the exceeding riches of glory that await us. And I think in the Bible we can read stuff like that and we can process it to a point. But I think the real value of what C.S. Lewis here is he gives us a very tangible image. These trials and these things that would be considered, part of hell, grief and pain and anguish. When we consider all of that, but we roll all that up, it amounts to nothing in the grand scale and in the enormity and the completeness of heaven. And then C.S. Lewis, hearkening back to Sarah, he says, I get it. He says, she couldn't fit into hell. It's like there's not room for her. Hell could not open its mouth wide enough. And somehow from there, it just gets better. He was asked, can no one ever reach them? He said, and George says, only the greatest of all can make himself small enough to enter hell. For the higher a thing is, the lower it can descend. A man can sympathize with a horse, but a horse cannot sympathize with a rat. Only one has descended into hell. And oh my gosh, what are you guys thinking when you're reading this? Because I know where my mind went. That's what he's referencing. You're right. But even beyond that, like, what were you guys thinking? Was there something like any principles or anything that came to mind? Doesn't have to be. I'm not looking for a right answer. I'm just thinking of what you guys are thinking. I think that's a twofold point. I think you're absolutely right. The fact that he did go to extreme lengths with generosity, with his mercy to extend to all men. But Lewis says that that Sarah, great as she was, couldn't fit in hell. Hell couldn't hold her. That only the greatest could descend into hell. And to me, that shows the enormous scope of the greatness of God, the greatness of Jesus Christ, in that he was the only one that could descend into a place so small that even in a glorified state, the saints who have been justified and glorified couldn't get there. How great was Jesus that he went down to hell, preached, as George said, there wasn't a soul in hell to whom he didn't preach. He went down there and then he came out. And so the question commonly goes, why don't, as was presented by that one skeptical, goes back to Lewis. He said, why don't these guys go down to hell and bring everybody out? Well, the thing is, he did. One already did. The whole discussion of time and eternity was interesting. A little bewildering. Okay, a lot bewildering. I kind of went, I read it a couple of times, going back and rereading it. I was like, You know what? I think the principle we're taking from this is George says, "Look, you're trying to understand something from within something that makes it impossible for you to understand this other something." He's like, "I get what you're trying to do, and I understand your curiosity, but yeah, there isn't a proper tense." This is the whole idea. This is why we call our minds finite. Because when you put things in eternity, everything breaks. Nothing is eternal except for the amount of time between the 15-minute, except for those 15-minute span before school lets out. That's eternal. That's a good analyzation, Unger. A two-dimensional being trying to understand how a 3D world works. There was, I feel like I read something recently. I was like that. It wasn't here. It was. What was it? I felt like I read something that referenced that. I can't remember what it was. To go back and try to figure it out. Anyways, it's beyond what we can understand. So trying to reach for answers from within the realm of time the answer is going to be incomplete, and we're going to come up with unsatisfactory conclusions. The last thing I really focused on is chapter 14, and George basically says, "Look, you're in a dream," and Lewis is like, "Aww." And George says, "Look, tell everybody that you're in a dream. I want them getting an idea that this is really the way things are, and this is canonical. But write it down. Tell other people, but make sure they know that this is just a vision, a dream. It's not real." And as the dream begins to fade, Lewis is facing west, and George is facing the east, and the sun comes up, and Lewis turns, and the light just absolutely is just it basically crushes him. It's overpowering. It's overbearing. His quote is, the morning, I cried. I am caught by the morning, and I am a ghost." And as much as we've talked, this is it's powerful because the truth of the matter is revealed in that the offer is always extended. But God is merciful and he is loving and he wants to extend joy, but at the same time the power and his glory are also very terrible. And to be caught without when the morning comes is a very truly scary prospect. And Lewis understood that. And I think he really conjures it here, where he's trying to hide from the morning because it's overpowering in the form in which he is. Now, obviously, he wakes up from the dream, and then the book abruptly ends. But the imagery here is just very profound in that while the coming of the morning takes those that are of that world, takes everything that belongs within heaven, and it glorifies it and it makes it more beautiful to those that are without. It is painful and it is agonizing. And that's both a very it's something to look forward to for us, because we know that we are saved, and we are going to spend eternity with Christ, and so we know that this is the glory that awaits us. But at the same time, for those that don't have it, this is something to be fearful of and to dread. Yeah, definitely. What do you guys think? Yeah, that's actually something. Spoiler alert. That's something I was looking at and wanted to really emphasize in Romans. Like, I'm not sure if I'm going to be teaching that week, but if I am, I'm definitely going to bring it out. Spoiler alert. Yeah. Um. Essentially, there's a point in Romans. It's, when Keza says Lewis makes it easier to understand that no one is being kept out of heaven by God. I said, yeah, there's something in Romans coming up that I want to reference along those lines. A Bible passage came to mind when I was back with Sarah and Frank. Well, it was a number of times. Sarah and Frank, and then the angel and the lizard. Because, like I said, I read the last 5 chapters today. Was the phrase "death is swallowed up in victory," and the idea of hell constantly wanting to cancel out heaven, and the Bible says, no, that's nonsense. Everything that hell is, everything that hell can be and that sin can be, is swallowed up in victory. That is secured. And that is powerful. But we've come to the end of the Great Divorce, and like I come to like the end of all my Bible studies, I ask, so what? So what? What are some so whats that we can draw from this? Now you decide to use the orange light.
I like the way that Lewis comes from the dream back into the real world, and not only the real world, but the real world during World War II. And it's like he's recognizing, I don't know if he meant this, but knowing him, he probably did. When we live our lives one day at a time and we're dealing with whatever ugliness is in front of us, it's hard to remember that we are actually fighting spiritual battles that are epic, even though we can't see them as they are. But like when telling us about this dream for a moment, our vision clears and we can see a little bit what we're actually going through. It's hard to keep that in mind, but I think it's important too.
Yeah, it's in Western civilization, we often romanticize warriors, soldiers, and even more than romanticize, we show tremendous honor to those that fight in the military now. And that's not wrong. But you want to talk about the ultimate soldiers? Every battle that we fight influences eternity. A state that will never end. And every time that we go to spiritual warfare, the result of that will affect the eternity in some way. Yeah. I think the thing that I've drawn a great deal from this book is how trying to think of how to put this. How things that we view as good, I can't remember what chapter this was in, but how things that we view as good in this life are not the good. And what I mean by that, I think it was going back to the Archangel and the Lizard. How George says an archangel is not a fallen. I have to go find the quote. Or a demon is not a. It's a fallen archangel and not something else. And so he's talking about how our virtues here. Oh, he was talking about the mother who was longing for her son. And Al Lewis was like, "Is it not?" It's like she had so much love, and George is like, "No, she had a defect in her love." And so her quote love became this thing that kept her from being able to love truly, because she desired this thing more than what she should have longed for. Whereas in glorification, what was her spirit's name? Reginald, I want to say.
Her brother.
Yeah, Reginald, he understood love much more clearly now, but she couldn't because she was consumed by this desire for one thing, to appease her. Here you go. Lewis asks, there are some natural feelings really are better than others. I mean, are a better starting point for the real thing? George says, better and worse. There's something in natural affection which will lead it on to eternal love more easily than natural appetite could be led on. But there's also something in it which makes it easier to stop at the natural level and mistake it for the heavenly. Brass is mistaken for gold more easily than clay is. And if it finally refuses conversion, its corruption will be worse than the corruption of what you call the lower passions. It's a stronger angel, and therefore, when it falls, a fiercer devil. And that's really a scary prospect, because when you think about people, we often say, oh, he was a good person, or he's a good man, they got a funeral, the good individual. Why? Was it because of these good things that they did? Because if we are unwilling to convert them over to the heavenly, to be a loving person on account of the one who loved us, or to be a joyful person because of the one who gives us joy, then what do we have other than perversions of God intended for us? There's the quote I was looking for. You and I must be clear. There's but one good, that is God. Everything else is good when it looks to him, and bad when it turns from him. And the higher and mightier it is in the natural order, the more demonic it will be if it rebels. It's not out of bad mice or bad fleas that you make demons, but out of bad archangels. The false religion of lust is baser than the false religion of mother love or patriotism or art, but lust is less likely to be made into a religion. Yeah. Whoa is a pretty typical response for me whenever I read anything that has C.S. Lewis's name attached to it. Anything else, guys? Ongarth, I know you've been quiet and you've chimed in on occasion, but I really want to get your insight because you've read this before. This was my first reading.
Yeah, it ties in well with his other works, The Four Loves, and Till We Have Faces. I think
Only one of which I've read, and it was a while ago.
Which one?
Four Loves.
Oh, you haven't read? Oh my
I
goodness.
have not read Till We
You're
Have
missing
Faces.
out.
Oh.
Look, I'm working on it.
We got to get you on that Till We Have Faces thing. I think that's my favorite Lewis book, personally.
Wow. That's saying something.
Although, I did just reread The Last Battle, and Rigney is right. That book is a lot better when you're older. I think that this book, I have a similar reaction to this book as I do to The Last Battle, actually. It's both scary and encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Scary because it shows the result of sins that we can recognize in our own lives, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we look through these ghosts, and I can acknowledge that at least half of the ghosts, I have the beginnings of that result in my life, which means that there's probably another half that I'm not recognizing that I also have those tendencies, which are probably the more dangerous ones, because I'm not recognizing it. But we can see that, right? I mean, we see that these people are hideous people because they have become their sin. But when we're honest with ourselves, and we're not trying to save face, and we're not trying to justify ourselves, I think we can see those sins in our own lives as well. And yet, so it is terrifying, and it should be. But at the same time, it's also encouraging. Because those that recognize their sins and bring them to God, they have the chance to have that sin transform into something that is used for God's glory. Right? Like the guy with the lizard. And the spirits themselves. I also think the other thing that's encouraging to me about it is just the realness of heaven. It was funny, after one of these times I was talking about in here about how we have this idea of kind of an ethereal, kind of misty idea of glory and heaven, and then I went to church and I actually took pictures. I should probably try and find pictures. Took pictures, and there's all these like every worship slide had like a very misty sort of like star scene with a cross like superimposed with like a little like fog, like a green or yellow fog. It's like, okay, this is why this is why we literally can't have nice things. But Lewis does a good job in this and in The Last Battle of moving us past that, right? We're not losing reality by going to heaven. We're moving on into the truer reality.
Yeah.
And that it was funny because Rigney's war cry in PUBG last night was farther up and further in. From The Last Battle. But I mean, it is that idea that like because I don't know, as somebody who grew up in a church when I was really young, before I had a Baptist education, grew up in a very charismatic church, where everything seemed ethereal to the point of like, I don't know, it seemed like at Heaven you were just kind of lose your personality, you become one of many voices just singing endlessly to God in praise in a kind of this misty, cloudy environment. And I think that we are right in being repulsed by that idea. Those of us who are repulsed by it, because I think that Lewis's idea is closer to what we see in Scripture, and what reality is, which is when you are willing to surrender yourself to God, to ask Him to save you, God will make you more into what you were meant to be, and He will bring you into a reality that is more real, and you'll want to go farther up and farther in, if you will, because it's the most natural thing. It's what you were born to do. It's what you were made to do.
Man, sorry, go ahead.
And I think that this book does a really good job of portraying that. Without taking the mystery out of Heaven, it makes it much more real for us. Go ahead, Winger, sorry.
Well, when you said that's what you're born to do, that is literally something that my pastor said this morning. He was going through the last bit of Titus. He said, when we submit to God and act and let His Spirit work through us, then we are literally we are doing what we were designed to do originally. And it's cool how stuff lines up like that. And he's absolutely right. That was the purpose we were intended for originally. We blew it. But in serving, in submitting to Christ and wanting to serve Him to further His glory and His kingdom and to make Him great, we are fulfilling the purpose to which we were made originally in the beginning. And so we are just refinding our purpose. Absolutely. This is why I'm such a huge fan of the term of Christians being called ambassadors, envoys. We're sent here to represent home. We're doing so well with all these Lewis quotes. Let's save the okay stuff for later.
Oh,
Oh, harsh.
Man, if Kess ever ends up on the East Coast, I'm gonna end up in a hospital somewhere. She's gonna beat the snot out of me.
Sounds good.
Nothing compared to what football is threatened by every day.
Say what?
It's nothing compared to what football has been threatened by every day.
being kicked out of his chair.
Yeah.
Or do you mean the things football has threatened? Whoops.
We'll fix it in post.
There's nothing to fix. We're perfect. This is golden. Oh. Yep. Yeah, can't have nice things. Fantastic. Speaking of which, that second we sang that a few weeks ago.